My name is Martin Clark, as I mentioned, and I'm here to discuss the research that we've been carrying out on the status and working conditions of artists and cultural and creative professionals. In particular, I'll be discussing the findings from our recent Creative Pulse survey that we just published the report last week, which we carried out along with Culture Action Europe. So I'll move on to the next slide. Just a quick introduction to Pantea. We are one of the largest organisations specialised in policy applied research in Europe. We're based in the Netherlands. And between 2015 and 2020, we coordinated the European Expert Network on Culture and Audiovisual for DG EAC at the European Commission. In the context of this, we carried out 2 OMC reports, preliminary reports for the working group before they started their work. These 2 were on gender gaps in the cultural and creative sectors and the status and working conditions of artists, which we'll be discussing today. Other relevant work that we've carried out, we've done lots of work in the music sector. We worked on the preparatory action in 2018 for the based on the European Parliament preparatory action for the Commission. We've also just launched a study with the European Commission to look at the discoverability of diverse European content in a digital environment. That's just started. We've also looked at copyright, for instance, for WIPO as well, and we've also done quite some sectoral work, including the theatre sector, heritage sector, and also the circus sector. Okay, so our study we did as part of the ENCA network on the status of artists was carried out in 2019 and was published in 2020. The objectives being to look at working conditions broadly, to also include, say, the nature of income, social security and taxation measures, the impact of mobility, and also looking at artistic freedom as well. As you can probably guess by the dates I provided, the pandemic happened during this time, which threw somewhat of a spanner in the works, but also really added to the research as well, because we could really talk about the current situation as we knew then on artists. So this report was carried out using desk research, as well as consultation with expert stakeholders and representative sectoral groups. We carried out a number of interviews and workshops, and there was also a steering committee that was involved in the project, which included Culture Action Europe, IETM, On the Move, Pearl, and FreeMuse. This study was input for the OMC group meeting with the member states, and obviously there's been the subsequent report as well as a Voices of Culture report on this. As Barbara mentioned earlier, there's now the Creatives Unite platform and obviously the legislative proposal from the European Parliament as follow-up actions since then. Based on this study, which was, as I said, mentioned, mostly based on desk research and interviews, we determined that artists and creative professionals were most likely to be self-employed, freelance, work part-time, work multiple jobs, which means that they're not obviously covered by social security protection in all cases. Artists and creative professionals are highly involved in cross-border mobility, and we looked at a number of different measures taken in the member states, with the most comprehensive laws being a wide range of concrete policies to address specific issues and the various challenges faced by artists. We also saw that some member states choose to discuss fair practice rather than fair pay in order to go beyond salary and link good governance with policies on diversity and inclusion. So there are different types of legal status for artists adopted within the European Union, as mentioned before earlier. Most member states have some form of measures linked to the self-employment and freelance regime, including unemployment insurance schemes for freelance artists, access to pension, dedicated taxation systems, and specific contribution systems. We've mentioned some of these prior today, but some of the interesting practices that come from this report and since, obviously the basic income for the arts in Ireland. There's also the Paying the Artist policy, which was introduced in 2020, focusing on ensuring fair pay and compensation for artists. In Spain, it was already mentioned as well, but the status of the statute of the artist there. Some measures have already been adopted in this regard, such as fixed-term contract models, specifically designed for artists, and adapting the definition of artists to include technical staff, as well as new unemployment benefits for artists. In the Netherlands, we have fair practice codes, which are included if it's they're a condition for receiving government subsidies. And in France, there's the intermittence du spectacle system, which allows performing artists to have access to social security coverage. So, following on from this, we decided to do the Creative Pulse study. One of the issues that we had with the previous ENCA report was we didn't really have a lot of data from the artist perspective. So we looked at, okay, we have EU-level data, the European Working Conditions Survey, sorry, but we don't find we can't really provide the sector-specific insights with this survey. It doesn't ask some of the questions, for instance, that we would like to know, which we included in our survey. There's also issues with NACE codes, which don't necessarily reflect the subsectors so well. So we decided we need to have some statistics to allow for evidence-based policymaking. Therefore, Pantea and Culture Action Europe, we developed a short survey regarding the status and working conditions of artists and creative professionals. We called it the Creative Pulse Survey. And in terms of the timing of this was really a response to the European Parliament proposal for the EU framework, and as a way to collect first-hand experiences from artists and professionals regarding their working conditions. And on the basis of this, we collected the data and we developed a short report for policy-making purposes. So in terms of the methodology, we actually launched two surveys. One was a survey of artists and cultural and creative sector professionals. The second survey was a survey of culture organizations, institutions, and policymakers. There were some questions which were the same, but some slightly different questions included, because we felt that questions related to the future policymaking aspects, maybe the artists weren't the best level to do this. Maybe they're not aware of kind of the European level developments, which we wanted to kind of get some feedback on. So we didn't ask exactly the same questions in both, but in some cases we asked generally the same questions on both surveys. We took a snowball approach in terms of getting responses. We disseminated the survey via web link through multiple channels, such as our own networks in the cultural and creative sectors, based on our work with ENCA, and also the wide network from Culture Action Europe members. We also had support from the European Commission on this as well. This led to what we thought was quite a good response rate. We received almost 1,500 survey responses, 1,200 of these being from artists and creative professionals themselves, which is very important. In terms of who actually responded to our survey, the majority were either freelance or self-employed, 62% were women, and in terms of the age profile, the majority were in the 35 to 54-year-old age bracket. There's quite a lot of information on this slide, sorry, but just to indicate the characteristics in terms of member states, we had quite an uneven distribution across member states, as you may be able to see from the data. We had a large number of responses from Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Italy, and Portugal. Unfortunately, not so many from Finland, I'm afraid, but maybe next time.
0 from Luxembourg.
Yeah, Luxembourg was the only country where we didn't actually have any responses in the artist survey. And also, in terms of the organisations, there was a kind of a mixed spread with some more than others, but we did have a lot of EU or multi-state level organisations participate as well. And in terms of the sector, we had quite a lot of responses from the music, performing arts and the visual arts sectors, also quite significant from the cultural heritage sector, audiovisual sector as well. The percentages on this don't actually add up because we also invited the artists to indicate more than one sector if they are multidisciplinary. So in terms of the actual findings from the survey, I'm going to run through some of the key ones now. So one of the main things we found was that artists in the cultural and creative sectors work multiple jobs. 68% in total of our respondents indicated this. Interestingly, a third indicated that these jobs are outside, these multiple second jobs were outside the cultural and creative sectors, which is quite a high amount. And the performing arts sector is the one where we're most likely to see artists and professionals working more than one job. The survey also reiterated the importance of cross-border mobility to the culture and creative sector. Nearly 50% of the respondents indicated they are involved in cross-border mobility, and 33% of these are frequently mobile. What was interesting from further analysis of the data was that artists and professionals working cross-border were less likely to report poor working conditions compared to those who were not mobile. We asked the artists and the professionals to reflect on their own working conditions. For this, we provided them with a definition and some idea based on Eurofound proposal of what working conditions consists of. This includes terms and conditions of employment, skills, employability, training, health, safety and well-being, working time and work-life balance, for instance. As you can see from the results, quite a high percentage indicate that they have poor working conditions, 46%, so nearly half. And the visual arts sector is where we found there was most likely to indicate poor working conditions. Unsurprisingly, freelance and self-employed artists were most likely to report poor working conditions. We also asked the cultural organisations, institutions and policymakers some questions on this as well. 71% believe that addressing working conditions in the sector is a priority, and just over half indicate that the working conditions have changed for the worst over the past 3 years. We have some information at member state level from member states where we received enough responses to be able to make some form of comparison. It's a limited sample, but it's just to give an indication in the kind of differences between the member states where we did have enough data. As we can see from the figures, Spanish and Italian artists are most likely to indicate poor working conditions. In the Netherlands and Slovakia, they fare slightly better. But as I said, this is a limited sample, but just to give an indication of some of the differences between. We also asked questions on the access to social protection in the sector. A very high percentage of artists indicated that they lack sufficient access to social protection, 71% in total. Freelance and self-employed artists and professionals were the most likely to have least access to social protection, which is not surprising. In terms of member state level, again, obviously bearing the limitations, once again, Spain and Italy artists were most likely to indicate they did have access to sufficient social protection. But as we can see from the figures, it tends to be quite high figures across the board in terms of a lack of access. We also addressed the nature of income in the sector. Many artists and professionals in the sector struggle financially. The vast majority feel that they are not fairly remunerated for their work. 84% in total indicated this. Mostly freelance and self-employed, but as we can see from the figures as well, it's generally it's quite high in terms of feeling that they're not fairly remunerated for their work. In the survey, we had a number of open and closed questions. So in the open questions, we were able to go a bit more in depth to give some context to why this was the case. In the case of income, we noted that there was an absence of pay rises or increases in fees over time, which caused this. Irregular payments from clients, for instance, was another major reason, and also restricted access to the market. We also looked at the impact of COVID-19. We know that the culture sector was one of the most negatively affected by the pandemic. 66% indicated that the pandemic had a negative impact on the working conditions, with the loss of income being the most visible result of this. In terms of that, 50% almost indicated that the pandemic had a negative impact on their income. We were also able to briefly look at the gender-related data, because we collected information on this as well. Women were more likely than men to report poor working conditions. Women were also more likely to indicate they were unfairly remunerated, and also were more likely to report lack of access to social protection. The only one of the anomalies was men were more impacted during COVID-19 in terms of income. Quite an alarming and surprising result of the survey was in regards to artistic freedom. almost over a third, indicated they had been impacted by limitations to their freedom to express themselves artistically, and almost half indicated that this had increased in the last 5 years. This was also reflected in the organisational survey as well. In the open kind of responses that we got, the political situations in member states was one of the biggest reasons for this, with survey respondents from both surveys indicating that this must be guaranteed regardless of changes in government and across borders as well. We also briefly looked at some of the main trends influencing working conditions in the sector. The lack of uniform status or definition of artist, as well as atypical working patterns, were having the biggest negative impact on working conditions, but mobility was seen as having the most positive impact on working conditions. So where does this lead us? We asked some questions on the prospective look based on the recent proposal from the Parliament and possible Commission actions on this. Well, there was a very high percentage indicating that of artists indicating support for European artist status, 93%. 71% believe insufficient attention has been given towards working conditions, and also there's majority support for legislation and for a status of artist. There was also high response rate support for a EU directive, as well for measures to address the digital transformation, and also the issues of social conditionality within the requirements of the Creative Europe programme, as well as 65% calling for strengthening cross-border mobility, which we see as a very important factor in promoting good working conditions in the sector. And there are also quite high percentages calling for more comparable data and exchange of best practices among member states. So what were the key lessons that we learned from this survey? The idea being mostly was we wanted to fill some data gaps that we noted from our previous research at the European level, but this was only a test in a sense, or a pilot to kind of see what we can do more in terms of data. In any case, we felt it was a valuable tool for understanding the realities faced by those in the sector, and this data can play a role in informing policy decisions and advocating for improvements in working conditions, particularly to address some of the gaps in the data that we get from the European Working Conditions Survey, for instance. We also see that artists and creators are very eager to engage, and the open responses to the questions provided a very good picture of the context behind the data in the sector. But we also understand that it's better to have a more representative sample across member states, so we can look clearly at the geographical differences and help to tailor more specific policies and to address these various needs. To do that, translation of the questionnaire would be beneficial, because we only did an English questionnaire for this one. But we also found that we're having connections in the member states with our network who we can get to disseminate the survey, really help to generate a high number of responses. So in terms of the next steps for what we want to do now, we want to explore possible follow-up actions with the data set that we have. We want to do some sector-specific analysis where we have high responses, such as music or performing arts. And also do some member state reports where we have enough respondents. We're currently doing a short report in the Netherlands now for some stakeholders there. So that would be interesting to find a more local related information from the data. And ultimately, we'd like to explore some further creative pulse surveys with our partners to also collect more relevant data. And the key, therefore, again, is building relationships with stakeholders in the various member states. But the main idea being that we promote an artist and creator-centric approach. So we're collecting data from the artists and the professionals directly, because this is the best source for developing tailored policy actions to address the needs. Thank you very much for your time.